himself was suspected of being a Nazi spy. Dalton played James Bond, 007, in The Living Daylights and License to Kill. He's also in Flash Gordon and recently appeared in the Penny Dreadful series and Doom Patrol. Two actors who were up for the role of Neville Sinclair, Charles Dance, who you might recognize from his work on Game of Thrones, and Jeremy Irons. Terry O'Quinn would play Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was a real person, billionaire, aviator, and recluse. You probably recognize Terry O'Quinn from his role as John Locke on the TV series Lost, although he's a character actor who has appeared in tons of things. The final person I wanted to talk about is the gangster, Eddie Valentine, played ably by Paul Sorvino. If there's a TV show or a movie about police, there's a good chance Paul Sorvino might be in it. He had a run on the TV show Law & Order and a very memorable role in the 1990 gangster film Goodfellas. My mother met Paul Sorvino at a restaurant many years ago, and he had come in and ate, and as he was leaving, she simply nodded her head and smiled at him, and he came over and was a charming, sweet fella, very nice, and my mother would not stop talking about it for months, maybe years afterwards, and I would not have been surprised if one day I came home and there were photos of Paul Sorvino all around the house. A charming fella, charmed my mother to no end, and I think that's pretty great. Paul Sorvino almost didn't get this role, which would have been unfortunate, but the person who turned down the role, Joe Pesci, I'm sure would have done something very interesting with it. There's at least a dozen other almost main characters in this film. Go to IMDb and check it out. There's some great people in here. Tiny Ron Taylor as Lothar is particularly great, and Max Grodenchek played Wilmer. I mentioned those two because they're both on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. One thing that a lot of people can agree on about The Rocketeer is that it has a great soundtrack, and that was composed and conducted by James Horner. It was released on Hollywood Records and has almost an hour of music, along with two vocal tracks that were performed by actress Melora Hardin, who you might know as Jan from The Office. You'll hear her sing on that show, and she's a very talented singer. But she also lent her voice to The Rocketeer. There was an expanded edition of the soundtrack released in 2016 with extra songs that were arranged by Billy May. The reason that was an important release is the year before, James Horner had passed away in an airplane accident. Loss of a tremendous talent. Worked on a slew of films. Some notable work he did would be on Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and James Cameron's Titanic, which is the best-selling orchestral film soundtrack of all time. He would also collaborate with James Cameron on the blockbuster film Avatar.
An innocent discovery.
I wouldn't touch that if I were you.
A powerful weapon.
I want that rocket.
A deadly conspiracy.
They're working for a Nazi agent.
An extraordinary adventure.
Jenny's in trouble.
We've got the girl.
Here he comes!
The rocket will come to us.
Oh, we're gonna get one back again!
The Rocketeer, rated PG. National sneak preview this Saturday night.
The film was released on June 21st, 1991, in 1,616 theaters, and earned a respectable $9.6 million in its opening weekend. It was number 4, and I guess the hope was that word of mouth would keep it in the top 10 for a long time, and hopefully go higher up. Unfortunately, a lot of big movies were coming out that summer as well, and The Rocketeer just kind of got lost in the shuffle. That very week, you had Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves still in theaters, and City Slickers, which along with the film Dying Young, were ahead of The Rocketeer. But even behind that, you had films that everyone would recognize even now, like Backdraft, Jungle Fever, What About Bob, Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, The Underrated Soap Dish, and Thelma and Louise. So week 1, it goes up against two films that hadn't been out very long, Robin Hood and City Slickers. Then the next week, the sequel to Naked Gun comes in, and it's the number 1 film. Then the week after that, week 3, Terminator 2 Judgment Day hits theaters. And then even after that, two movies that you'll recognize that did very well, Boys in the Hood and Point Break, get into the mix. And that's sort of all she wrote for The Rocketeer. It would continue to hang around in the top 10 up until about week 4, and then would disappear. So on its budget of somewhere between $35 and $36 million, it would only make $46.7 million, which, while it sounds profitable, was much lower than what Disney had hoped. Disney put a lot of hopes in it. It was actually the first film to premiere in the restored El Capitan Theater, which had been under restoration by Disney for 2 years. Beautiful 1,100-seat theater. Disney would spend $19 million on TV advertising alone, and they had a television special documentary titled The Rocketeer, Excitement in the Air, which was broadcast on the Disney Channel in 1991 promoting it, and major tie-in endorsements with product lines like Pizza Hut and M&M's. Pizza Hut had these very cool meal deals that you could get that had the Rocketeer beverage. You could find a lot of that stuff on eBay for a pretty reasonable price. The reviews for the film at the time were mixed. A lot of people liked the special effects and they liked the action, but at the same time they said it was a little slow. One of my favorite reviews and quotes about the film comes from Peter Travers of Rolling Stone, who said, "The Rocketeer is more than one of the best films of the summer. It's the kind of movie magic that we don't see anymore. The kind that charms us rather than bullying us into suspending disbelief." Hits the nail right on the head right there. The film would be nominated for a Hugo Award. It would lose to Terminator 2 Judgment Day. In the Saturn Awards, they would win an award for Best Costumes, which are amazing. And they would also receive a nomination for Best Special Effects and Best Supporting Actress for Jennifer Connelly. The film was released very quickly in Laserdisc and VHS, and there it would earn an additional $23 million in rentals, so that sounds pretty good. As I mentioned, the musical score was also released on both cassette and CD, and that sold reasonably well. In 1999, they would release the film on DVD, although it's a very bare-bones release with not a lot going on. It wouldn't be until 2011 that a special edition as a Blu-ray. So you had a film, it did okay, but it did not meet expectations internally. Disney had all sorts of plans for The Rocketeer, and many of those might have even made their way into the parks, but the film was seen as a financial and critical failure. As I mentioned, they had even planned this to be a trilogy, but because it had not lived up to expectations, those plans were put on hold. And pretty quickly, by July of 1991, they had decided that this wasn't going anywhere. The film, though, did develop a cult following, and there have been calls for a sequel for a long time. In 2016, it was mentioned that a Rocketeer sequel would be in the works. Actually, I think they described it as a reboot, but since it has to do with somebody else finding the rocket pack after, it's actually a sequel with all new characters. That keeps coming up. It was mentioned again early in this year that it was going to happen. In the meantime, they have made a animated Rocketeer TV show on Disney Junior. It's an adorable cartoon, which features the 7-year-old great-granddaughter of Cliff Secord, Kit Secord, who finds the rocket pack and very happily becomes a superhero. I would love to see a sequel or a reboot of the Rocketeer film, and I'm sure if one gets released, I will be one of the first people to see it. Do I think it is going to be a hit? My guess is no. If I were Disney, I would focus more on the animation. I think they could do a very cool adult animated series of it, maybe even a continuation of the original. And do keep the Disney Junior one going. It's a cute idea, visually fun to see, and it keeps the Rocketeer in people's minds.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Blast off with the Rocketeer against Neville Sinclair, the enemy agent, and his henchmen. This game for your Nintendo Entertainment System provides the kind of action the Rocketeer lives for. Blasting Sinclair's thugs, snipers, booby traps, enemy flyers, and heavy artillery. The battle will lead to many places, from the Bulldog Cafe to a Zeppelin high in the Hollywood skies. So don't wait. Propel yourself into high adventure. The video game from Bandai.
And now, back to the show.
There were some tie-ins with The Rocketeer. There is a novelization by Peter David that is very faithful, but it has some nice new details if you're a hardcore fan of The Rocketeer. Peter David is a very well-known writer. In addition to other novelizations, he wrote some great Star Trek books, including some of the Q series, Q in Law, Q Squared, and one of the best-selling Star Trek novels of all time, Imzadi. You would think that since Disney saw the potential of the Rocketeer, that we would have seen more toys, but basically you had a 9-inch doll that was made of plastic that you couldn't pose by applause, and a Bendham Rocketeer that had a pack that you could put on and off that wasn't really all that fun to play with either. Topps also had a line of collector cards, and they did produce some video games. There are 2 versions of the game, a 1991 NES game from Bandai that I think is a little bit more fun. It's a platformer, and it uses the jetpack in it. Nova Logic released a PC game that was more of a series of mini-games. This version would be ported to the Super Nintendo in 1992. Unfortunately, none of these games are very well reviewed or respected, but if you do have to play one, I would suggest the NES version. I think it's a little bit more interesting. There have been releases of Rocketeer merchandise since the Rocketeer was released, including reproductions of the helmet, figures. Most recently, Funko has gotten into it with their Pops and Legacy line of products. You also have beautiful Rocketeer figures from Diamond Select, and of course a retro figure from Reaction. The Rocketeer is a charming film, filled with very talented people. It's one of those films that unfortunately didn't work for everyone, but to those who did fall in love with it, it is considered a classic. Remember, as time goes on, your opinions change. So if you haven't seen The Rocketeer in a long time, why not check it out again? You might find that your opinion of it has improved. If you've never seen it before, and if you like films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, or anything set in the 30s, or callbacks to old Hollywood, check out The Rocketeer. It's a fun film, and one might even say it's a lost classic. Thanks for listening to the show. For more retro fun, you can drop by the website at retroist.com. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at twitter.com/retroist. The music you hear on the show is by Peachy. You should follow Peachy on Twitter. He's at twitter.com/peachypixel8. That's Peachy, then the word pixel, then the number 8. Just look for the Welsh flag. This is the first episode I am releasing since I started a Patreon campaign. If you're interested in supporting the Retroist, you can drop by the site and click the support link, or you can go straight to Patreon, and that's at patreon.com/retroist. I'm going to jump right in and tell you about some of the people who've decided to support the show. Thanks to Abby Wellwater, Les Orchard, Vince Bray, Jeremiah Jones Goldstein, Mark McDonald, Greg Pear, Pastel Paperback, that's fun to say, John Duckworth, The Last Hometown, Johnston Van Ark, Mark Zodi, Mark Dirksen, Evil Knievel, Steve Hanna, Flip the Table, David Wall, Bill Beams, Justin Salvato, and Chad Kozlowski. Thank you all for jumping aboard, and I hope to connect with more of you who listen to the show there. Thanks to everyone for supporting and listening to the show, and I hope you have a great weekend. Disney might have miscalculated because that week, this blockbuster film was defeated by the film... What film was that? Where am I?
This has been a Retroist production. Goodbye.